Hey everyone, welcome to our session on supporting people with non-apparent disabilities in the workplace. We are so excited to be here today. Now, to kick us off, we want to do a little bit of an intros. So, as for myself, my name is Aubrey Blanche. I'm the Director of Ethical Advisory at a nonprofit in Australia called the Ethics Center, as well as a consultant for organizations on responsible business operations and artificial intelligence. Today, I'm coming to you. I'm sitting here. I'm a phenotypically white woman in a white sweater with orange, purple, and blue hair and a little bit of red lipstick. But I would absolutely love for my conspirator here to introduce herself as well.
Thank you so much, Aubrey. My name is Lauren Freedman. It's such a pleasure to be here. My pronouns are she, her. I am also a white woman. I've got some longish, curly, blondish hair and fair skin, and I'm wearing a red button-up sweater and also some red lips. And really excited to be here today. Should I say what I do as well? Have we covered that,
Yeah,
Aubrey?
yeah,
Okay.
for sure.
So I will say very briefly, I am a health coach and I specialize in supporting individuals who are living with chronic conditions, with neurodivergence, with disability. And I came to this work through my patient advocacy work. I am also the host and creator of an award-winning podcast called Uninvisible Pod, which is about living with non-apparent chronic conditions and disabilities. So what do you know? Same wheelhouse. So thrilled to be here with you. And do you want to share a little bit about what you do as well, Aubrey?
Yeah. So, as I said, I've spent the last sort of 10, 12 years of my career working in technology, specifically in diversity, equity, inclusion, or adjacent roles. And my work really centers the ideas of anti-racism and disability justice, both because I think that when we focus on the particular barriers that folks from those communities face, we actually build better solutions. But I also am someone who has multiple non-apparent disabilities. So I'm bipolar type 1 as well as ADHD. And so I can kind of speak from a mix of both professional experience in terms of implementing strategies within organizations, but also I think figuring out my personal health journey of what do I need to do individually. So I have like that empathy and practice kind of shoved together.
Yeah.
But Lauren, as we come into this, I think something that's always been really helpful for me around figuring out what I can do, right? Because as someone who does have a disability, working in the disability justice space, it can be really easy to get overwhelmed. And so something that was really helpful to me when I got my original diagnoses was the idea of spoon theory. And I feel like you do such an amazing job of talking about this. So I'm wondering if you could get us into a little bit about what spoon theory is and then talk about some of the kind of tools that you use with your clients to manage their capacity and figure out what's possible in any given moment.
Thank you, Aubrey. Yeah, I should say also lived experience here as well as working with people who are in our community. But when it comes to spoon theory, this was something that I learned relatively early on in my own chronic condition journey. And I would say it has really helped me to give language to my energy capacity in a way that is understandable for the people around me, whether that's friends, colleagues, anyone else in my circle. It's based on an essay that was written in, I want to say 2008, by someone named Christine Miserandino. And it's actually really quite easy if you put Christine Miserandino and spoon theory into a little search bar on the internet, you will probably come across the blog on which Christine posted about spoon theory. But in essence, what it is about is the essay that this comes from is based on Christine actually trying to explain her energy capacity to someone who didn't really understand, particularly because there were no visual markers for her condition, right? And for those of us who are living with chronic conditions, particularly those that are non-apparent, there can be a lot of different experiences that we go through from really extreme fatigue all the way to chronic intractable pain that we can be enduring at any given time. And a lot of the time, people have no idea. And even if we try to explain it to them without showing them in some way, it's really hard for people to understand it. I think part of that is because we also are used to the disability sign being a picture of a person in a wheelchair, right? Which is a great symbol and really helpful for disability marking, in a parking spot, for instance, right? But when it comes to the experiences that we are having, if we do not use a mobility aid or any aids that might give an indicator for our capacity, having chronic pain, having chronic fatigue, and other symptoms can really run down your energy a lot faster than your average person's. But the idea here is that every person wakes up with the same number of spoons in their bank, right? And as you go throughout the day, different tasks cost you different amounts of spoons. And for one person to get up, set their alarm, wake up to their alarm, get out of bed, maybe make the bed, go have a shower. Maybe they're waking up with 20 spoons and they're using one or two just to go through their morning routine. It could be that someone who is living with any kind of chronic condition or disability, which includes neurodivergence and mental health conditions, right, might be waking up and going through the same routine, but waking up maybe with 10 spoons instead of 20, and maybe using 4 spoons to go through the morning routine where someone else uses one or two. So we're talking about a deficit in energy as it compares to what I like to call a pre-disabled person. And this is a term that also we can probably get into at some stage. I shy away from the term able-bodied for very particular reasons. And many years ago, when I was producing my podcast, I had a guest come on who said, no, 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 that's pre-disabled. Able-bodied is pre-disabled because all of us, if we live long enough, we don't get out of this thing called life without relying on the healthcare system at some stage and probably having a couple diagnoses and maybe a few prescriptions to go along with them, right? So, understanding that we are all living in either disabled or pre-disabled bodies, which helps to remove some of the shame, stigma, and judgment around the idea of a disabled identity as well. And that some of us just have a diminished capacity compared to others. And it may require us more energy to do similar tasks just because of all of the other things that our bodies are doing behind the scenes that you may not see, but which are A, not necessarily any of your business unless I decide to make it your business, and B, also really important to understand in the context of your capacity professionally. And from a disabled point of view, learning to communicate with that capacity is can be really helpful.
I love that. And you're getting at something that I care a lot about, which is the way we use terminology to describe things.
Mm.
I also, I'll tell kind of two stories. One, I love the idea of pre-disabled, but also the number of people who might think of themselves as pre-disabled who are actually already disabled. So my particular example is I've been wearing glasses since the third grade, and I absolutely didn't consider myself a disabled person until I was diagnosed as bipolar, which was pretty late. I was in my 30s. But the reality is that having poor vision, which I do, is a disability. But the language thing I wanted to get into actually has to do with the title of this conversation is I remember when we were kind of conceptualizing what we wanted this to be about, we talked about the different paradigms of visible versus invisible and apparent versus non-apparent. And
Mm.
I think we landed on this idea of non-apparent disabilities because invisible is a form of erasure, I think, and it's also a very subjective thing. So even though you can't see my bipolar, it's actually very present to me. It's not invisible to me. And so by denying that or recognizing that different disabilities are not always invisible, if I am in a hypomanic state, which doesn't happen very often, but if it does, it's actually quite visible to people, sped up speech and things like that. And so I just want to talk about that. I think this is actually a preferable way to talk about disability. Again, with a note that if someone personally uses different labels for themselves, it's not appropriate for us to correct folks. But I think in general, using this apparent versus non-apparent paradigm is actually much more inclusive of the complex way that disability becomes obvious to another person versus the person with a disability. I don't know if you wanted to add to that, but for me,
Mm.
it's more respectful of the complex nature of the way that disability manifests.
Yeah, and as you're talking about that, Aubrey, the thing that's becoming really obvious to me as well is the idea of dynamic disability. And
Mm,
this relates to use of energy and capacity as we move through the world, right? For each of us, it might take more energy for Jane to talk to her family than it might take for me, right? It might take Joe more energy to talk to their boss than it might take for me to, right? And understanding that we all have different emotional responses, but also that sometimes, especially when it comes to these non-apparent pieces, right? Just because, for example, someone uses a mobility aid doesn't mean that they need to always use it. A, to be
mhm.
considered valid and who they are and a real human being in the world. B, to be believed when they tell people that they are disabled. And C, to be understood by the people around them. I think this happens, or the trap happens socially the most for people who use mobility aids with dynamic disabilities because they may use the aid some days and not use them other days. But when it comes to capacity, we often hear, about someone having to cancel plans, perhaps, or say, oh, I can't make it to a function that I had scheduled to do because I just don't have the capacity, or the spoons, to sort of lean on that spoon theory analogy from which the term spoonie as an identity has arisen. But understanding that some days there is more energy than other days. And there are numerous factors that can go into how that manifests itself. It can do with the quality of your rest. It can do with your stress levels. It can do for some people an allergy and perhaps being hit by a food allergy the day before. So understanding that disabilities, like our identities, like our existence in this world, are dynamic and can be fluid, and that we need to really start taking responsibility for taking people at face value when they are brave enough to share who they are with us, because that also, in the culture that we have created around capitalist ideals, has really limited our way of understanding individuals, because we really try to put people in boxes and try to understand them through the labels that make sense to us, rather than going to them and understanding them on their own terms. So just to sort of underscore the point that you're making there, I think it's really important to understand that there are differences in the way that one person's disability or chronic condition, however they choose to identify, may show up on a given day.
I think that's so important. I often talk about the idea that actually everyone is disabled. So if folks don't know, in disability theory, you basically end up at no one's disabled or everyone's disabled, but we all end up at the same point in the circle. Now, we are here talking about the workplace. And so one of the things that I've always done as an executive is think about and try to make the case that the types of things that people need in the workplace are actually quite easy to implement most of the time, but also really educating people about the curb cut effect. So this is something really common story in disability justice. But Lauren, I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about what the curb cut effect is, and then I can chat a little bit about some data about how that shows up at work.
I want to shout out my friend and our colleague, Tiffany Yu, for actually teaching me the term curb
Oh
cut
yeah.
effect.
Oh, shout out to Tiffany forever. She's
Yes,
so
Tiffany
amazing.
Forever. She has written a fantastic book called The Anti-Ableist Manifesto. I was lucky enough to be involved in the developmental edit of that book, and you're quoted in that book as well.
I also weirdly like helped her edit the book. I was just like, "Hi, can I help you in any way whatsoever?" Like
It
creepy
takes a
stalker
village.
to just be like, "I just want to help you because I think you're the most amazing person." Anyway,
Yeah, but
yeah.
this is what happens when spoonies get together, is that we're all like, "Wait, you're doing such neat stuff. Can I play with you in your sandbox?" And we all end up being friends, which is really nice. It's a
So
very
anyway,
loving
follow
community.
Tiffany on every platform, buy her book.
Yes, Tiffany Yu, YU, Tiffany Yu. But I learned about the curb cut effect from her, and it is this. It is that, when you reach the end of the curb and you're going to cross a street and you've got a stroller because you are a parent and you've got one, maybe more children in your bassinet. Maybe you've got a dog in there or a cat that you're taking on a walk. Maybe you've got your granny stroller and you're doing your grocery shopping, right? But there is a dip in the curb that allows you to cross the street without having to bump the wheeled device that you are using onto the crosswalk. And that makes it a lot easier to move around with rolling luggage when you're traveling, for example. But it was actually developed for mobility aid users, specifically wheelchair users. And this is something that has been developed for the disability community that benefits the disability community, but wouldn't you know, actually benefits all of us. So when you have to push around a heavy cart full of production equipment and you have to get it across the street to a studio, that dip in the curb is there because someone with a wheelchair fought to get it there. And now it's also helping you. And there are plenty of other examples of devices and different assistive learning technologies that have been developed similarly and really can serve the community in that way as well.
And so I love that. The idea, it really goes back to my personal theory of change, which I call equitable design, is the idea that when we look at an experience that's at the margin in a particular context, which often means a disabled experience or a racialized experience, is that when we design a solution that works for people with those particular lived experiences, we end up creating benefits for a broader set of the community, right? So at Culture Amp, we rarely do programs that are specifically targeted at white women, for example. But we found that our programs that were designed with the needs of women of color in mind actually meant that white women's experience also improved, but we didn't have to kind of choose. Whereas when you design for folks closer to the center, you often leave out those folks on the margins. But
Hmm.
at work, it turns out that the curb cut effect is not only really effective, but it's actually generally quite cheap. So the job accommodation network actually shows that in the workplace, about 54% of job accommodations that are requested cost nothing. And
That's
so I
incredible. Can we just talk about
right.
that for a second?
Yeah,
Nothing.
yeah, yeah.
So it costs you nothing to make someone feel more understood, more heard, more seen, more believed, and more efficient in your workplace because you're making them happier. It costs you
And
nothing.
you make them able to do their job. And I know neither of us are exactly on the capitalist train, but like even if your sole motivation is to make someone a unit of productivity in a capitalist system, providing them the things that they need is really important. Before I get back to some more like ideas around what kind of free accommodations exist, like I also think it's really important to talk about my theory of accommodations, which I think Lauren, you would agree with, which is
Mm.
every single person receives accommodations at work. It's simply that certain people's necessary accommodations are the default in the workplace.
Yes.
And so, calling out that like that accommodations are both incredibly normal, but also are not special treatment, you could actually make a pretty strong argument for the idea that, for example, neurotypical people receive special treatment at work by virtue of our workplaces being set up to support them. So, just
Hmm.
wanted to shout out to that idea. But as an example of what an accommodation might be, someone might need their feedback in written form. So this is
Hmm.
quite common for folks with autism or ADHD or other neurodivergences that have executive dysfunction issues,
Mm.
is that they may not actually be able to auditorily process feedback that comes back. Now, if you think about that, following up maybe a tough conversation with some written feedback to ensure clarity is not exactly a difficult or unreasonable management task that might be useful for everyone for a variety of reasons. Or having flexible schedules. So whether that's like some remote teams I know where they have core working hours where everyone needs to be online or in the office, and then flexibility around the edges, or you just empower your folks to take breaks when they need to manage their own schedules, assuming that their output or their work gets done. That is an example of an accommodation.
Mm.
And then there are, all the way on the other side, things like ensuring that meeting agendas are sent out in advance. Like I just think of this as good hygiene
Yeah.
for running a meeting, but it turns out for folks who are autistic or who, quite frankly, are also introverted, which may or may not be a disability, depending on your theory of environmental access.
Mm.
The idea that even introverted people, on average, tend to be less comfortable speaking extemporaneously compared to extroverts. And so, by providing context on the experience of the meeting ahead of time, you're letting folks with a variety of different neurotypes actually more fully participate in the meeting, which ultimately, again, if you want to make the capitalist argument, is going to get better ideas and better outcomes for your team. So, those are some examples of assistive or accommodation kind of things that don't cost anything. And at the end of the day, they're really great examples of the curb cut effect, where whether or not you identify as having a disability or have the experience of a disability, those are the types of things that make the workplace work better. It's just that it happens to be especially beneficial for people with particular types of disability.
I've been nodding and smiling so much during everything that you've been saying because basically I agree with everything that Aubrey says. Everything Aubrey says and does, I agree. Uh, blanket acceptance here. But it's also for me bringing up, when it comes to the idea of accommodation versus lack thereof, right? It also makes me think about management styles, micromanagement versus management, right? Just regular sort of like more hands-off management. And um, it's interesting because I believe that there are statistics probably from the Job Access Network as well. Um, and I believe that this was covered in the Anti-Ableist Manifesto too. Get that book, learn it, share it with everyone on your team. But that providing the accommodations that are requested by people while 54% of those accommodations may be free, it will actually cost your company less to accommodate than not. Because the money that you will spend in turnover because someone decides to leave the company or decides to sue the company because of, bad practice or violation of the ADA here in the States, right? The Americans with Disabilities Act. So violations of certain legal precedents around the definition of disability and accommodation. That's all going to cost you much more than just letting someone put headphones on in their cubicle, right? And maybe paying for a set of headphones that maybe cost you $30. And particularly for people who are in the office, right? One of the big conversations that became a major talking point, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, which by the way is still going on because there are still immunocompromised people that we need to protect, is one that brought up a lot about remote work. And remote work was something that had been requested by members of the disability community for decades. And COVID-19 rolled around. Prior to this, managers, CEOs, anyone higher up the chain, no, 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 we have to maintain our work environment and culture. We have to stay in close contact with one another, etc. And this has actually precluded a lot of people who really want to work from working in ways that are safe for their bodies. And COVID-19 happened, and immediately it was remote work because that was better than stopping work altogether. And the immediacy of this accommodation being offered was a bit of a slap in the face to many members of the disability community. And it's something that we are seeing as offices are bringing people back to work. People are having to go back into the office, right? And as people are being asked to go back into the office, I talk to people all day, some of whom are disabled and some of whom are not, who have difficulties with having to go back into the office, perhaps because they have kids who need to get to things and they find pockets of times to get the kids to the things and they've been able to save money on childcare. Perhaps because they are helping care for a loved one and have had to use those pockets of time here and there to be able to do that. And they've been trusted to do their jobs from home up to this point. But going back into the office often also feels like micromanagement, right? And they feel like suddenly they do not have the capacity to show up, as the kind of employee that they want to show up as. And this is a really common story. And then they're showing up and being micromanaged, right? And all of the money and time that is spent on checks and balances to make sure your employees are working when actually you can probably trust that they're going to do their jobs because people do care, right? For the most part, people do want to do well. And if they're performing poorly, that's more a question about management than about the individual, typically. But understanding that if someone comes to you and says, I still need to maintain this remote work accommodation, that the question around accommodation, and in fact, the question around return to work, return to office, is one that has created a lot of discomfort for people. And I imagine on higher levels, we're probably seeing turnover at a lot of companies as a result. And when you look at the amount of time that is saved in commuting, in what you are, covering for someone's expenses in gas if they're driving, or perhaps travel cards if they're using public transport, uh, you are taking up a lot more of a person's time than just the time they're using in the office. Whereas when they're working remotely, they're much more in charge of their own schedules and can actually use some of that time outside of work more effectively to manage their own lives. So I just wanted to bring that into focus as well, because this is an important conversation around accommodation. Also, in many ways, sort of adjacent to the conversation about the curb cut effect, right? Because this was something that we've been asking for a long time. And now that we have it, we're also seeing productivity go up. So I've been really confused by a lot of the return to work orders that have been issued by a lot of corporate entities. What about you, Aubrey?
I'm not at all confused.
Mm.
I find it generally silly. So, I'll two comments, one a bit editorializing, one based on actual data. So, one of the partners of this event, Culture Amp, full disclosure, I was an exec there for 5 years. I'm still an advisor for them on their ESG program. But they actually crunched the numbers on their more than, 1 million data points of employee experience. And what they found is there actually isn't a strong correlation between in office work and productivity and collaboration. So, what they found is that hybrid workplaces often had the highest engagement, but also that it was more about the norms around that. So, if you're in the office, what's the purpose? I find that the reason that there's a priority for in office is because the people that are making decisions personally prefer it and don't necessarily value or know about the impacts that it has on other folks. So, these are generally, non-disabled cis het white men who are running organizations, and because it works for them, they've decided that there's that. I think there's also economic incentives, which is companies have poured a lot of money into leases their landlords are probably not letting them out of. And so, like, I think it's really important to question the overall, like, oh, this is for collaboration or productivity. And the problem is either that's a lie or someone isn't actually qualified to be making a decision because they're not actually looking at the empirical data about that. So I will say that there's some pretty messed up incentives. I also think it's pretty silly. We saw that it was possible to collaborate well in remote environments. It does take a different skill set and a different approach to collaboration. So I don't want to sit there and say that, oh, you can just go remote and everything's fine. I have friends who are founders of all remote companies, and the way that they run their teams is actually meaningfully different than folks who are in hybrid or co-located organizations. So I'm all for hybrid work. I like going into the office. Um,
And a
a
lot of
couple
people do,
a couple days a week, it works for me.
yeah.
But I am not, putting like a big thing about my ethical framework is what works for me does not necessarily work for you, and it's not my place to tell you what should work for you. But I also wanted to go back to the idea of accommodations in the workplace, because something that's really important to note is that even in this climate where it seems to be spicy to give a shit about the humanity of other people, politically,
God, I
there
love you.
right, like I just don't know why we're arguing about this. Like,
Nope.
oh, disabled people are human. Okay, newsflash. The reality is that laws on the books, despite the hype and marketing coming out of the US administration right now, the ADA still exists. And so if you are a workplace, whether or not you have an accommodation policy, you are liable for creating reasonable accommodations for disabled people. So the advice that I give my clients is like, you need an accommodations policy and you need to implement it well. And so what I mean by that, and I'll chat a little bit about the framework that we put in place at Culture Amp. So I also want to shout out Vashi Murugas, who was on our team at Culture for like 5 years, and she was the one who really spearheaded this. So shout out to her for the work that she did. But really, our accommodations policy is something that's easily written down. So it's easy to reference and find if someone doesn't want to talk to someone about that. But there were principles that we incorporated into that policy that I think made it more effective. So, number one, we really emphasize that we believe accommodations are an iterative process. So while as an HR team, we're not going to tell you what accommodations are available, we can direct you to resources like Jan that can give you some inspo, but we don't necessarily expect that you ask for one accommodation, we give it to you and you go away. We recognize that you may try that accommodation, it may not work as well as you anticipated, or your needs may change over time. So it's really important that an accommodations process flexes and changes to someone's lived experience of disability. The other thing that I have a major problem with is when it is required to have a diagnosis in order to receive an accommodation. So I think this is
Preach.
problematic. We know that the disability tax is real, so it can be very expensive to get diagnoses if you can even get them. So it may not actually be medically possible, but may not also be financially possible. This is especially true for people who come from economically disadvantaged communities, which are more likely to be, for example, communities of color. And so at Culture Amp, the way our process works is that we do not by default require a medical cert or a diagnosis. We do request the right to get input from your care team or your medical providers. And that's not from our view to prove that you have a disability. We actually don't need you to prove anything. We actually don't even need you to disclose a diagnosis. But sometimes, depending on the impairment or challenge that you're describing, we're not qualified to approve or provide an idea of what is there to support you. That is not the role of HR. It's to work with you and understand if what you're asking for is possible within the work environment. The I guess the third piece is that sometimes we do say no. So, but we never say just no. We say no, but. And what I mean by that is sometimes people ask for things that are not possible within the context of our organization, but we will always try to offer an alternative that we believe also fits the need, or at least we're hoping someone is open to trying to see if it works. And we're committed to getting that person assistive support. So I think it's an attitude shift in the way that we deal with things. Sometimes people do ask for stuff that's unreasonable, like that does happen. The last thing is be really broad about what you consider a disability. So, a spicy topic that comes up in actually our women's ERG about every 6 months is this idea of menstrual leave.
Oh,
And
please give it to everyone. Stop
I
asking why. We're
didn't
bleeding.
plan on talking about periods on this chat,
I
but I
always
actually
plan on talking about periods. Please
so
go.
I will go to the mat that I think menstrual leave is stupid. Like,
Whoa,
get
you
at
and I
me
are
on
going to
the internet
actually
about this.
disagree. Okay,
Um,
wow.
so I'll tell you why, and then I really want to hear why you disagree with me.
Mm-hmm.
So my thing is because I think that it is actually problematic philosophically to carve out specific procedural and policy-based accommodations for specific disabilities. And I believe that menstrual pain, endo, all kinds of things that you experience are reproductive disabilities. And so they should be treated with the same flexible, person-based accommodations that are required. So at Culture Amp, for example, we include examples in our accommodations policy of accommodations that have been granted for reproductive disabilities. So do I think that things like severe menstrual pain and endo should be supported? 100%. Do I think there should be a special policy because you have a uterus? No.
Okay, I can get on board with this. And I wish that this were kind of the way that we saw all accommodation and disability policy, right? Because part of what I was going to address in what you were talking about when it comes to the HR need to often have proof or diagnosis, right? What do you care? As long as someone's doing better because you're helping them and you're making them better employees, what do you care what someone has? Also, it seems like a bit of a loophole from where I'm sitting uh, of a violation of the ADA because under the ADA, you're not allowed to walk up to someone and say, "What have you got?" right? No one's required to answer that question. Um,
It's so
it's
inappropriate.
so inappropriate as well. Like that's none of your business, whether you are in HR or whether you are out on the street and see someone with a service dog, right? And From that point of view, my feeling and experience of this is that the people who I speak to who are largely employees having difficulties and anxiety about disclosing at work
Mhm.
are struggling because of fear of retaliation, which is also illegal, the retaliation, right? At least here in the US, but is a really big gray area and is one under which management and HR can often operate sort of covertly,
Mhm.
right? Or perhaps non apparently. Uh, I really came full circle there.
Invisibly.
Invisibly rude. Um, so, uh, I really do think that based on what you're saying, okay, sure, we don't need menstrual leave. But I also think that part of the reason that we need to keep campaigning for it is that we need a broader and gentler understanding that women's bodies or the bodies of people with uteruses are going through different processes than the bodies of people without. And I think that there's another awareness piece here, which is that if you have menstrual pain and a doctor has told you that's normal, they're wrong. I am not a medical professional, but what I have learned in my many years as a patient and as a patient advocate is that any pain that you are having on your cycle is some kind of reproductive health concern and perhaps something larger, perhaps with regard to your hormones or with regard to fibroids or growths within your reproductive system. And it's important to have these things checked out and to push for the right kind of care. That said, I fear as an individual and an employee that we will never see menstrual leave unless we keep pushing for it, even if it is folded into disability accommodation. And I can see the need to continue to advocate for it so that we raise awareness of the particular health needs of individuals with uteruses. But I also can really understand your argument, Aubrey, not only from a logistical point of view, where it makes so much sense, right? Because endometriosis is a disability. I don't care how you slice it. Um, but also from the perspective that when someone tells you that they need space, that they need time, that they need rest, that they are in pain, that they need to go for a particular treatment, we need to believe them. As you've said, also, there are instances where someone asking for an accommodation can be denied, and these things do happen. But if you were to lay out the averages of the disability accommodation requests that are within the realm of reality based on what we're talking about today, I would say that by and large, you would find that people asking for these accommodations are being quite reasonable, and that maybe the people who are not are very few.
I think that's true, at least in my experience, is like I will admit I have had some incredibly off the wall accommodation requests across a decade of
But
career.
wait, define off the wall. I really want to know what that means.
So like someone in a role that involved like being very customer facing and like answering a lot of questions from someone like requested an assistant to do 30% of their job for them.
Mm,
And but again, I would say like less than one half of 1% of the
yeah.
accommodation requests that I have personally been privy to do I think are unreasonable. Like for the most part, people are pretty basic. So
And
yeah, that
also, can
was
I say something about the assistant thing too?
yeah.
A lot of people are doing 2 and 3 people's jobs right now. That's the job
Totally,
market, right?
totally.
So, like, also understanding, like, are you being reasonable in what you're asking a person to do in their job role responsibilities? Have they agreed to all of these responsibilities when they signed on? But I see what you're saying. Yes.
No, actually, what you just said, I feel like we have the same brain, which is I actually think that in the case of this, it was a company that I was advising. What I said is what picture did you paint of the job when you recruited this person? And so I think there's also a mindset shift here in which, like, as the powerful institution, which is what a company is the first question when something goes a little off the rails like that is ask, what responsibility did we take for creating this situation? It doesn't mean it's always on the company. Sometimes there are unreasonable people, like that happens in the world. But in this case, when we did a little bit of digging, we found that the way the role was described and pitched was not the way the day-to-day of the job actually
Mm,
unfolded. And that was coming from a company that wanted people to be really excited about the
yeah.
job. And they had this like very common in technology, which is where I've spent my career, where they were like, we want everyone to be like the most fulfilled they've ever been in their lives in this job. And we kind of had to sit down and have a conversation that, like, that's a really inappropriate way to run your business, in the sense that there may be some people who are incredibly fulfilled by any role in your organization, but what you're actually looking for is someone who can competently perform the tasks that you've assigned. And it's completely valid for someone to seek personal fulfillment in that role, and it's completely valid for the person next to them to just need a paycheck and be competent to complete what they need to
Yep.
complete. And so once we had that conversation, we realized that it was actually about an expectation setting exercise with this employee. What we did actually do was work with their manager and them to restructure their workday so that when they were at peak executive functioning, they were able to do those tasks that they found more difficult. So we were able to
Hmm.
actually find an accommodation that solved the need that person was having.
But again,
But
an
it
iterative
involved
process.
Right. And it involved us bringing in, a coach who specializes in folks who experience executive dysfunction to kind of get some expertise, because my ADHD manifests, I've got hyper-focused flavor, so like that's not my problem. And so I'm not an expert in the kind of inattentive, manifestation of that. But one other thing I will say that I didn't say about Culture Amp's process that I think is useful for other companies related to this is, in this case, we brought the manager into that process, and that was done with the full knowledge and consent of the employee. And so, one thing that I love about Culture Amp's process is actually that your manager is not involved in the accommodations process. So you either go to the HR team, your HR business partner, who's been briefed and who has worked with the equitable design team to understand the policy. But your manager only gets disclosure on a need to know basis, which for the vast majority of cases means that your manager is notified of a specific accommodation that has been granted and is provided no other information because it's not necessary for them to provide it. Or in some cases, your manager isn't notified because it actually doesn't matter to them. So
Mm,
I wanted to call that out, that your manager shouldn't be the one that's deciding or paying for accommodations, because it creates a conflict. And so, for example, at Culture, we also have a separate accommodations budget that the EDI team manages, which means that a manager or a director is never choosing between funding something for the team and funding someone's accommodation. So there's actually a set aside budget that gets allocated every year, so that we're never denying it because they say, oh, well, I don't want to pay for that because I want to pay for this team member's travel or the team lunch. It's a completely separate consideration that the manager actually isn't involved in.
It's so wonderful that there are companies that are offering this kind of equity and this kind of open conversation, right? And this is the thing that I think traditionally has dominated the conversation around disclosure, is that there will be discrimination. There are not supports set up. That even bringing up the idea of an accommodation will force retaliation. And that is beginning to change. And I guess that's also part of the conversation that we're having today, too, right? That we are moving through changes in the way that we experience the workplace. Some of that has happened as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic hitting all of us in its own way, right? But some of that is also to do with the evolution of the social justice movements that you and I are involved in, and the conversations around equity in the workplace. And it's important to also stay up to date with those policies, with those conversations, so that you're also remaining relevant as an employer, right? So that you become a talent seeker from which you have a pool to actually invite really interesting people who want to work for you and do the job competently, right? Whether or not they get their value from being at that job or elsewhere, as long as they're doing the job competently, but that you will actually get the highest levels of talent from people who are more involved in these kinds of intellectual pursuits, conversations around difference, understanding, and accepting other people. And that's what it all comes down to, right? Like the function of HR, we know, has always been to protect the business. But I think the piece that we miss in companies that are falling behind is that it's also there to protect the employees too, right? And that we need to do what we can to make employees feel valued, feel understood, feel accepted at face value because they're accepting the company at face value too. And while we all have clauses that say we can change our minds and things can change, perhaps we can give notice about those things. And perhaps we can also consider whether or not those changes are based in our own bias or whether they are based in actual data and the need of those most vulnerable. And that sort of harkens back to the conversation about menstrual equity too, right? And menstrual leave, because women are more vulnerable on the whole than cis white men, right? And perhaps that's because of the uterus piece. I don't think that's it. I think it's all of the social structures that have, because we're not the dominant force of the social structures. But the idea here that all of these policies from a corporate perspective need to be geared to create space for the most vulnerable people to succeed. Like you want to set people up to succeed, and that's the point.
I think so. And one of the things that I love about that, I feel like that was the mic drop moment, is that this idea that you want people to succeed is actually where multiple value structures come together to the center of this like complicated Venn diagram. So whether you want someone to succeed because you believe in human dignity and you want someone to feel valued and seen, or whether you're trying to use a human as a unit of capitalistic productivity, right, as kind of opposite ends of the spectrum, it actually comes together. And this idea that providing flexible options in the workplace and really leaning into trying to create that curb cut effect in your workplace is what's actually going to make sense. But that requires believing people when they tell you about the experience they're having and what they need. So I am mindful that we are at the top of our time. And Lauren, it is such a joy to be in community with you. I feel like we could spend the next 6 hours talking about this.
I do too.
But is there any parting words of advice you have for folks listening?
Yeah, there's something I didn't share earlier on, which I should have shared, that I will share now because I know we were talking about like the kinds of accommodations, and
Mm.
there is as much for us to learn as employees as there are for employers, from a communication perspective, right? Aside from the general anxieties and fears that come with the potential of disclosure, there's also often when we are granted accommodations or when we are thinking about asking for accommodations, this idea of asking for help is foreign to a lot of us, right? And putting ourselves in a vulnerable position like that can be really confronting. And one of the tools that I developed, which is based on the spoon theory that I discussed at the top of our conversation, is just an energy capacity indicator, whether you are using it to understand your own capacity on a deeper level, or whether you are using it to indicate to others where your energy capacities are if they're thinking of knocking on your door or your cubicle wall and saying, hey, can I pass this over to you, right? Is something that I call the spoonful capacity indicator. It's real simple. And what I will do is I will share my screen and share with you what it looks like in PDF form. And then I will show you where you can get it. But this is what I call the
Yeah.
spoonful capacity indicator. Awesome. So this is a PDF that there's a little bit of a description here about the definition of a spoonie or also a chargey, because we also use the analogy of batteries to describe energy capacity, right? It is a spoon. You can color it in. If it were Aubrey and I, we would be coloring it in with rainbows. You might be someone who just wants to color it all in with one color, whatever works for you. But I have all these lines on the side so that you can write down little notes as you go throughout the day, right? Like getting ready to come to work and coming here took me up to this line. And I want to just make a note that it takes me that much energy, right? If the spoon represents your entire day and all of the energy that you have. So it's something that's worth like printing a couple copies out, playing around with. And I believe that this will be linked on the Rethinkability site, but if not, this is my website. Now, can you see my website is the question. I don't think you can.
Mm-mm.
So let me just stop my screen share and I will reshare my screen so you can see the website. But here's my website. So if you are looking to get a spoonful capacity indicator, they're totally free because they are based on someone else's theory, right? I'm not going to charge for these. You can actually type in chroniccoachlauren.com as well as uninvisible coaching, but that seems kind of long and involved. And you want to click on tools in the menu. There's also a pop up for now, but it's under the tools section. And it is one of the options. If you scroll down here, the spoonful capacity indicator, and you can just download it right here on the website. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of that, but also this understanding that like the onus is on both sides. But as an employer, are you giving your employees everything that they need to succeed, not only in the accommodation itself, but in learning how to request it? Are there opportunities to have conversations or open up conversations or bring in experts to speak on things like disclosure, not just from a legal perspective, but also from the perspective of this is the emotional journey. This is the onus is on us, right? This is what some good professional correspondence might look like. And how complicated does it need to be, and how simple can it be, right? Because one of the things that I'm coaching people on every day is how am I saying this? Am I even comfortable asking for this? What do I need to succeed? Because they may not know. And how can you support your employees in understanding what they can have access to or how they can begin to understand what would make them even happier in their roles? Because at the end of the day, we want everyone to be happy. We don't have to be drinking the Kool-Aid per se, but we want everyone to be enjoying themselves in the workplace and feeling proud of the work that they do and finding value in that. And that involves not only the accommodation, but the conversation about how that happens and the language that we use, which brings us back to the very beginning, full circle. Aubrey, what would you like to share?
I love that you just went from the individual perspective. And my advice is actually for the not yet disabled folks, which is it does not matter what your job is. Pester people if there's no accommodations policy at work. Ask them what the hell they're doing instead of getting that in place. And you are best positioned if you are someone who maybe at this moment is not needing that accommodation to say, I'm not comfortable working at a place where my coworkers don't have access to this. What do you need? There are lots of people who can help you build that. There are lots of resources online. So truly, I think there is no excuse. And it's time for us all to kind of ask our workplaces to get some stuff in writing and get the processes behind it. So
Yeah.
with that,
Yeah.
um,
Oh, can I say one really quick thing with
yeah.
that? With that, let's not forget that this conversation started as a conversation about non-apparent disability in the workplace, right? And I want to just remind everyone, just because you can't see it or experience it in the way that someone is telling you it exists does not mean it is not real for them. So, can we also learn to take people more at face value when someone tells you that they need something? Do you need to know why? Do you? Or can you just say, you know what, that's really easy for me to buy you a $30 headset? Right? Like if that's what it takes, then that's what it takes. So I just wanted to add that piece in there. But like ultimately, this is also about the nature of accommodation and the way in which we offer or request, isn't it?
I think that's so right.
Mm.
Now, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for coming and spending your time with Rethinkability. We are so grateful for you joining us for this conversation, and we will
Yeah.
see you online.
And Aubrey, if anyone wants to find you, where can they find you?
Oh, they can find me on my internet soapbox, also known as LinkedIn, and they can get me at aubreyblanche.com.
And if you want to find me, chroniccoachlauren.com, and I'm at chroniccoachlauren across the socials as long as I remain on them, and Lauren Freedman on LinkedIn. And really grateful for the time today. And Aubrey, thank you for holding space for this conversation. And yeah, getting me on board with that menstrual leave piece.
Oh,
Hey,
yeah. I love when it starts as a fight and then we end up on the same
I
side.
mean, that's going to happen with us anyway.
Have a great day,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.